This is module 5.5.6, interactions of flowering plants. In this module, we're going to discuss three primary interactions that flowering plants have with other groups, primarily animals. The first interaction we're going to discuss is fruit dispersal in particular. The second interaction we're going to discuss is pollination. And the third interaction we're going to discuss is agriculture. So first let's talk about fruit and fruit dispersal. You should recognize that a fruit is in fact a mature ovary, and this forms a covering over seeds. Fruit has two major roles. The first role is to protect the developing seeds. And this is why fruits are often very hard around the immature seeds. The seeds are not ready for dispersal, and so the plant protects them. The second major function is to aid the dispersal of mature seeds. There are two major categories of fruits. Fleshy fruits, which are the ones that humans almost exclusively think of as fruits unless they have some botanical training, as you are receiving right now. So you should also recognize that beyond fleshy fruits, that there are also dry fruits. And fleshy fruits are typically eaten by animals, while dry fruits often perform a hitchhiking type of duty, or perhaps maybe they can have a wing to enhance dispersal by inanimate means such as wind, something like that. Now, to understand the importance of dispersing the seeds, let us just think for a moment about competition. Who is the best competitor for a member of a species? It turns out that the best competitor is a member of the same species. They have all the same tricks, they have the exact same adaptations, and so especially devastating is a competitor of the same species who is older and more mature. And this is what often happens when a parent plant produces seeds. And if those seeds settle right under that parent plant, they are virtually doomed. And there is, as a result, a very strong evolutionary selective pressure for seed dispersal. This graph that I'm going to show you illustrates this point. Now, in science, it's very important when you are studying or drawing graphs to pay particular attention to the axes and how they're labeled. In this case, we have the horizontal axis down on the bottom here, and it is detailing the distance a seed arrives from the parent plant, either very near or farther from the plant. And then on the left vertical axis, we have the number of seeds, and we can see that this graph shows the number of seeds. And so the vast majority of seeds do end up very close to the parent. And virtually all of these seeds, the little plant embryos inside those seeds, are doomed. They just don't have a very good opportunity at all. If we look on the right-hand vertical axis, this is percentage survival, and we can see that they are indeed doomed because their survival is very low near the parent, and survivorship goes up as you get further and further from the parent. And so this is an illustration of the basic importance of seed dispersal, and it is the reason that plants are willing to invest in things like fleshy fruits to entice animals to move their seeds far away. And so you might think, I've taken this apple from this plant, but in evolutionary terms, the apple is manipulating you to disperse its seeds further from the parent plant, and it thereby increases the fitness of the apple tree. To further illustrate the very important role of fruits, we can look at this graph. This graph contrasts the features of an immature fruit and a mature fruit. So let's go down these features. The first feature is the sugar content, very low in an immature fruit, so an animal is not enticed to eat it. But a mature fruit has typically high sugar levels, and therefore an animal would be enticed to eat it. Defensive chemicals, just the inverse of the sugar content, very high in the immature fruit, protecting it. And in the mature fruit, the defensive chemicals are broken down or removed from the fruit. The fruit texture, it's very hard in an immature fruit, making it very difficult to eat, while the flesh of a fleshy fruit softens in a mature fruit. And of course, the fruit color. In an immature fruit, really a synonym for an immature fruit is the color green. And it is not an accident that a fruit whose seeds are not ready for dispersal is colored green. That way it matches the foliage and kind of camouflages the fruit so it will not be easily seen or eaten by an animal. On the other hand, once the seeds become mature, then this fruit will change to a bright contrasting advertising color, such as red. Red is the contrasting color with green, and it really shows up. One thing you need to understand is that from the perspective of the plant, by far the most important aspect of fruit ripening is the maturation of the seeds. And so what triggers most of these changes over in the right column under mature fruit is when the seeds become mature. And so that will complete the first interaction that we wanted to talk about. The second interaction that we want to talk about with the flowering plants has to do with pollination. Now, pollination ecology is really one of the fascinating areas of biology. It studies interactions between the pollination vector, which can be wind or any kind of animal. Often pollinators are insects, but certainly not always. And the flower features that have co-evolved with these pollinators. It's really very interesting. And I've given you quite a bit more information than I really expect you to know on the following slides just because of the interest of the interaction. So we'll just kind of flip through them and I'll give you kind of the high points that I think you should know. You should absolutely recognize that nectar is simply sugar water that some flowers provide as a reward to animal pollinators. The first type of flower we're going to look at are windflowers. Windflowers are plain small flowers that produce no nectar. They don't need to be pretty. They don't need to provide a reward because their pollen is moved by the wind. Now, in addition to the features that I've just mentioned for windflowers, wind-pollinated plants tend to grow in large homogeneous stands, that is, stands of the same kind of plant. So grasses occur in grasslands. Marsh plants that are wind-pollinated occur in large tracts of marsh plants of the same species. Although not a flowering plant, another wind-pollinated group of plants are the conifers, and conifers typically occur in large forests made of the same species. So it's a very typical thing. If you look at the structure here, these larger structures are the stamens that produce the pollen, so they produce large amounts of pollen, and then they pollinate everything. And the stigma, the part that receives pollen, is a large and feathery part here, so they can receive more. So those are typical features of wind-pollinated plants and flowers. Bee-pollinated flowers, these are large, showy flowers, often with blue or yellow colors. Definitely not red, because bees can't see red color. Red is visible to humans, but not to bees. On the other hand, bees can see on the other end of the spectrum a little bit better. They can see in the ultraviolet range, and there are some of the bee flowers that have markings that are called honey guides, and these are visible only in the ultraviolet range. So it's like there's extra patterns on some of these flowers that humans can't see because we don't see in the ultraviolet range, but the bees can. And of course, the flowers don't care if humans can see them because humans don't pollinate them and bees do. Often, these flowers have a large landing platform because bees are large-bodied. They may have a tubular floral structure so that only certain bees can pollinate certain flowers. And bees are really one of the most important groups of pollinators. I will tell you one thing about honeybees and honey, and that is honey is concentrated nectar, and the way the bee concentrates the nectar is by regurgitating it. So that means that honey is really bee barf. Ooh-wee. I love bee barf. Doesn't detract my liking for honey at all, but some people might be affected in a bad way. Butterfly pollinated flowers, these are butterflies have these long coiled mouth parts, and the flowers may be tubular, but not necessarily. Butterflies are typically active in the day. Some can see red, so they will visit red flowers, and they visit other flowers that are similar to bee flowers, yellow and blue and purple, and they also are rewarded with nectar. And so there's some overlap. You will see butterflies and bees visiting the same flowers. Moth-pollinated flowers are white or other pale colors, maybe yellow. They will emit a very nice odor, but typically just after dark. And some of the flowers will only open after dark. They don't really need a landing platform because many of the moths typically hover, members of the sphinx moth group, what we call the hawk moths. And so some people actually produce gardens strictly for moths. We also have beetle-pollinated flowers, and beetles require lots of food, and they have jawed mandibles, or toothed jaws, which are called mandibles, and they will chew up flowers. And so often the flower is very large, and the flower itself can be the reward for the beetle. But there may be nectar or pollen that the beetle can eat for a nutritious reward as well. And either there's one large flower or many small flowers, and often the odor is somewhat, we might call it interesting. There's a strong odor, fruity, spicy, or fermentation odors. They can be unpleasant to humans, but again, the plants don't care about whether or not humans like them because they really just want to attract the beetles. And sometimes in the case of beetle-pollinated flowers, the ovary that contains the ovules, because the beetles are chewing on the flowers, the ovary will be located very far down in the flower. We'll call it an inferior ovary at times. Another example would be fly-pollinated flowers. These will be a dark color like raw meat, maybe kind of a liver or maroon color, but sometimes they have an odor that smells like decomposition, trying to attract these flies. And there are other families of flies besides blowflies, which of course want to visit dead animals and carrion. But other flies that don't eat meat, they can visit all sorts of flowers. Another example of a particular flower that's pollinated by a particular group are bird-pollinated flowers. And these flowers are often red, a very attractive color to birds. But because the birds that pollinate typically don't smell very well, if at all, the flowers are often odorless. And so sometimes humans will see beautiful red flowers and they'll go smell them and there's nothing. And once again, the plant doesn't care because it's making the flowers attractive to its pollinators, birds. In the New World, that is the New World tropics in the United States, Central America, and South America, the bird-pollinated flowers typically don't have a perch because the birds that do most pollinating are hummingbirds, and they hover. In the Old World, we have sunbirds. Here in the lower right, we see a sunbird, for example, in Africa. And the flowers often have sturdy stems where the sunbirds can perch. In addition, bird-pollinated flowers often have little hairs, and these hairs serve as an obstacle to small insects that might go in and steal nectar. And the plant really only wants to give the nectar to an animal that's going to pollinate, not to some random small insect that visits. The last category of flowers we're going to consider are bat-pollinated flowers. Like moth-pollinated flowers, these are white, and they open at night. They tend to be very large and strong because bats beat around and bump into them, and they produce large amounts of nectar. They have typically an intense, almost fermentation smell that's fruit-like. Bats have a muzzle and long tongue, and so they can have, these flowers can be tubular. And an interesting example of coevolution is the fact that in the nectar of these flowers, there is a lot of proline, which is an essential amino acid, an amino acid that bats can't make and is part of their flight membranes. And with that, we're going to conclude the second interaction of pollination, our discussion of it. And we're going to just briefly touch on the third interaction, which is very important to you and me, because that's agriculture. This is a pact or an interaction between certain crop plants and humans in which we will care for and eliminate competitors of agricultural plants, and they in turn fetus. And agriculture started in a substantive way about 10 to 11,000 years ago, something like that. Humans were domesticating seed plants as a very reliable food source. This allowed a few humans to feed all of us and allowed the great diversification of human culture. There are about 200 vital crop species today. That's down from the number of plant species that we fed upon as hunter-gatherers. So we have a simplified diet relative to our evolutionary history. And agriculture has contributed to evolutionary success of certain seed plants, and seed plants have in turn contributed to our success. And with that, the third and final interaction of the seed plants, we will conclude this unit.